You weren't supposed to hear this. What I'm about to tell you was meant to be buried under a century of coal dust, locked in courthouse basements, and spoken of only in whispers between men who no longer sleep soundly. In September of 1884, 3 armed enforcers of the most powerful corporation in West Virginia vanished into the black lungs of the Appalachian Mountains. Days later, their bodies were found in shallow graves by Elkhorn Creek, each killed with a precision that defied the weapon they were killed with. And walking out of those woods, carrying that weapon as if it weighed nothing, was a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Weaver. His clothes torn, his face calm, his eyes cold enough to make seasoned miners shiver. When asked why he did it, he said only 3 words: "They deserved worse." The county sheriff sealed the files and labeled the case resolved by mutual agreement. But there was nothing mutual about it. The truth is, Thomas Weaver had just declared war, not against men, but against an entire system of control, against a force older and darker than the coal company itself. You think this is just a story about a boy with a gun? No, this is about how power survives, how it hides its hand, how it shapes a man before he even knows he's being shaped. Because Thomas Weaver wasn't born dangerous, he was made, crafted like a weapon by the land, by hunger, by the quiet, merciless lessons passed down through generations of mountain men. And the men he killed that September were not just trespassers, they were the armored hands of an empire that wore no crown, flew no flag, yet ruled every acre of these hills. So I'm going to take you down into those hills, deeper than the coal shafts, deeper than the company records, down into the machinery that grinds men into silence and boys into something far more dangerous. Once you hear the truth, you can't unhear it. Once you step inside, you can't walk back out. And if you keep listening, you may find yourself changing in ways you can't explain. But that's how forbidden knowledge works. It doesn't just answer questions, it plants them. And the moment you start to see the patterns, when the shapes in the dark begin to take form, you understand why some truths were never meant to survive in daylight. We begin in the last autumn before the killings, when the coal company's grip on West Virginia tightened into a fist, and a family named Weaver found themselves staring into the eyes of a predator that didn't look like a man at all. The coal-scarred mountains were more than a place. They were a living thing, black-veined, breathing, always hungry. In 1884, the Consolidated Coal Company had stopped pretending it was there to bring progress. It had brought something else, a private kingdom carved from timber and stone, where the law was whatever the company's enforcers said it was. They didn't need a courthouse, they didn't need a jury. They had something far older than law: fear. Whole towns became company property. Land deeds vanished from courthouses, replaced with ledgers marked in script and credit slips that trapped miners like insects in amber. The company's scrip, worthless anywhere else, bought your food, your tools, and even the nails that held your roof together. And if you fell behind, if you missed quotas, or worse, if you questioned orders, men would come. They wore no badges, carried no warrants. They didn't have to. It was in this world that Samuel Weaver tried to keep his family's independence alive. His cabin, perched above Elkhorn Creek, stood like the last tooth in a rotten jaw of company shacks. 3 generations of Weavers had hunted these ridges, and Samuel still cut his firewood with the same axe his father had carried back from the War of 1812. He was a man whose hands bore scars from both coal and war, whose lungs rattled from dust, but whose spine had never bowed to a company foreman. His eldest son, Jacob, was 17, built broad and tall, restless with the kind of fire that turns boys into soldiers. The younger one, Thomas was different. Small, quiet, unnerving. His mind worked like a trap you didn't see until it was already sprung. He didn't play like other children. He watched, measured, remembered. His eyes stayed on people long after they looked away, as if he were reading the lines of their thoughts. Thomas had been raised by his grandfather Ezekiel as much as by his father. The old man was a relic of an older America, one that survived by knowing exactly how far a man could push another before he broke. Ezekiel taught him to hunt, to track, and to disappear, but more importantly, he taught him the truth no preacher or schoolmaster would ever say out loud. In these mountains, mercy is a luxury you can't afford. By the summer of 1884, even that cold wisdom was being tested. Wages had been cut twice in a single season. Bread was scarce. Men died in the mines weekly, sometimes daily. When bodies came out, the company made sure there were no witnesses to how they looked, because crushed bones and blackened skin told stories no supervisor wanted told. And the coal police had grown bolder. They began riding beyond the company towns, reaching into the hills, making examples of anyone who thought they lived beyond the company's reach. That's when the weaver's name appeared on a list, not a public one, the kind of list kept in a locked desk drawer, written in a careful hand, with names that someone in power had decided needed to be erased. Thomas never saw the paper, but he knew. He saw it in the way his father loaded his rifle differently. He saw it in the way his brother kept glancing toward the tree line during supper. What none of them could have known was that the first steps toward the 3 shallow graves at Elkhorn Creek had already been taken. Not with a gunshot, not with a fight, but with the quiet scratching of a pen on company paper. It began with a petition, a sheet of paper no bigger than a Bible page written in Samuel Weaver's neat, careful script. On it were the words, "Every miner in West Virginia wanted to speak, but most didn't dare. The mine's timber supports were rotting. The air below ground was thick with gases that could suffocate a man before he reached a ladder. The equipment was breaking down, killing workers in accidents the company called unforeseeable. And the foremen, those smiling agents of the coal empire, made sure that anyone who refused to crawl into a death trap was fired, blacklisted, and, if they still didn't take the hint, visited in the night." 47 men signed it, not agitators, not union men from the cities, but mountain fathers who wanted to see their children grow up. Each one knew that putting their name on that paper was like putting it on a tombstone. Samuel believed the only way to survive was to deliver the petition publicly, where other miners could see, where a foreman might think twice before spilling blood. But there's something you need to understand about power. It doesn't think twice. It doesn't pause to consider fairness or reason. It moves in silence before you even realize you've made a move yourself. One of the names on that petition didn't belong there, not really. Henry Caldwell. He'd been a miner all his life, a man with debts so deep the company store practically owned his shadow. His youngest daughter was sick, consumption, and the company doctor was the only one who could keep her alive. Caldwell didn't want to betray his friends, but fear is a better persuader than loyalty, and that night, before the ink on the petition had even dried, Caldwell told the foreman everything. By sunrise, the coal police had their orders, not the official ones, the kind passed along in the back rooms of saloons, spoken quietly, without signatures or witnesses. That morning, Samuel climbed down into the shaft of mine number 7, the petition folded in his coat pocket. He'd rehearsed his words. He'd thought about how to keep the foreman from acting in anger, but when Augustus Blackwood, the company's black-hearted overseer, read it, he didn't get angry, he didn't shout, he just smiled, tore the paper into strips, and let the pieces fall into the coal dust at his boots. "I want every man who signed this," Blackwood said, his voice carrying through the tunnels, "to report to my office when the shift ends." Every miner knew what that meant. Reporting to Blackwood's office was like walking into the woods with a wolf. You didn't walk back out. That night, Samuel sat at the table with his sons. Cornbread, beans. The rabbit Thomas had shot that morning. He told them everything, about the petition, about the summons. Jacob wanted to fight. Thomas said nothing. He just stared, the way he did when he was fitting puzzle pieces together in his mind. And then, the sound of hooves, slow, deliberate. The sound of men who knew their prey wasn't going anywhere. 3 shadows appeared at the window. Finch, Hutchinson, Crawford, the company's trinity of violence. They didn't knock. They didn't need to. Marcus Finch stepped into the doorway first, tall and wiry, dressed in black like he'd just stepped out of a funeral, maybe yours. His hair was the color of cold ash, his eyes like ice that never thawed. Finch didn't need to shout to be heard. His kind spoke in measured tones that told you he had already decided how the night would end. Behind him came Dale Hutchinson, a man built like the mountain itself, thick, scarred, and slow-moving in that way predators move when they know you can't outrun them. His hands were the kind that had broken more bones than they'd shaken. The air seemed to shrink when he entered, like the room itself didn't want to be near him. Then there was James Crawford, average height, average build, the kind of man you wouldn't notice in a crowd. But his eyes, they had nothing in them. Not hate, not pleasure, just a void where a soul should have been. Crawford was the one they sent when they wanted something done clean, quiet, permanent. The three men stood in the weaver's cabin without invitation, the way you'd stand inside a barn before slaughtering what's inside. Finch spoke first. "Samuel," he said, drawing out the name like it tasted bitter. "Your employment with the company is finished. You have 30 days to vacate the property, and a word of advice, don't take any more interest in things that don't concern you." It wasn't a negotiation, it was a sentence. Samuel didn't rise. He stayed seated, elbows on the table, eyes locked on Finch. He'd been in war. He knew men like this. The mistake was in showing them fear. "This is my land," Samuel said, voice steady. "It was my father's land, my grandfather's. I work it. I live here. My family will die here." Finch smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "That can be arranged." Hutchinson took a slow step forward, his boots thudding against the wood. Crawford's gaze shifted to Thomas. Not Jacob. Not Samuel, but the boy. He studied him like he was measuring him for a coffin. Thomas didn't look away. That unsettled Crawford more than he'd ever admit. The air in the cabin thickened until every breath felt like work. Finch tapped his fingers on the table once, twice, then leaned down just enough so that Samuel could smell the whiskey on his breath. 30 days, he repeated. "But if you make us come back before then, we won't bring shovels." The three men turned and left. No slammed doors, no threats shouted over shoulders, just the slow scrape of boots on the porch, the creak of saddle leather, and the sound of hooves fading into the night. But Samuel knew what that meant. Finch didn't give warnings, he gave countdowns, and for the weavers, the clock had just started ticking. Thomas sat in silence long after they'd gone, his small hands resting on the table, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about 30 days. He was thinking about the rifle Ezekiel had taught him to use, and how long it would take to line up the perfect shot. That night, the mountains seemed different. The wind that usually rattled the pines carried a slower, heavier rhythm, like something unseen was pacing just out of sight. The weaver's cabin sat in its usual hollow, but Thomas felt the walls closing in, thick logs and nailed boards turning into the bars of a cage. His father tried to sleep, but Samuel's breathing told another story. Short, uneven, the breath of a man rehearsing arguments in his head he'd never get the chance to make. Jacob paced the kitchen, restless, jaw tight, muttering about getting the old shotgun ready. Thomas didn't move. He sat on the edge of his bed, the moonlight drawing silver lines across the floorboards. His mind replayed every detail of Finch's visit, the sound of his boots, the way Hutchinson's shadow swallowed the light, the way Crawford's eyes locked on his. Those weren't just threats, they were claims. Finch's men had already decided where his family's story ended. But Thomas didn't see an ending. He saw an opening. He thought about the lessons Ezekiel Moore had given him, lessons the old trapper never shared with anyone else. How to move without snapping a twig, how to lay a snare where no man would notice, how to track a deer in the dark by sound alone, and, most important, how to wait. Waiting was the part most people couldn't stomach, the cold, the stillness, the silence stretching until it became a living thing in your head. But Thomas could. Even as a boy, he'd been different. He didn't just watch, he memorized. The shape of a man's shoulders, the way he favored one leg, the weight of a rifle when it was loaded versus empty. He got up without a sound, crossed the room and opened the small chest at the foot of his bed. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth, was the rifle Ezekiel had given him the year before. A long, lean weapon that could take down an elk at 200 yards if the Hooter's hand didn't shake. Thomas ran his fingers along the barrel. Cold. Perfect. In the corner of the chest was the small pouch of cartridges, each one checked and polished like coins. He didn't plan to use it tonight. Not yet. Tonight was for learning. By the time the first light touched the mountains, Thomas was already in the woods, moving along the ridgeline above the road that led into the hollow. He found their tracks. 3 sets of horses, the iron shoes biting deep into the soft earth. The weight distribution told him who rode where. Hutchinson's horse was the heaviest. Crawford's had a slight limp in the back left shoe. Finch's was fast, long-strided. Thomas crouched low, touching the cold dirt, committing every detail to memory. This wasn't just scouting. This was a slow etching of names into a different kind of ledger, the kind you don't keep on paper. Somewhere deep inside, a part of Thomas had shifted. It wasn't rage. Rage burned fast and bright, and then it was gone. This was something colder, sharper, the kind of thing that didn't fade, the kind of thing you carried with you until the right night came. And Thomas knew that night was coming. The forest before dawn is a different world, half shadow, half memory. The ground was slick with last night's frost, each step a careful negotiation between silence and speed. Thomas moved like Ezekiel had taught him, pressing the ball of his foot down first, letting the heel follow without sound. Down below, the road bent along the creek, and there they were. Finch, Hutchinson, and Crawford. The 3 of them rode without speaking, their breath steaming in the cold air, their horses' hooves muffled by the damp earth. Thomas stayed high along the ridgeline, using the trunks of old pines as cover. He kept far enough to avoid being seen, but close enough to watch them like a hawk tracks mice in a field. Every few minutes Finch would look over his shoulder, not in suspicion, but in habit. The man was always scanning, always thinking. Hutchinson lagged just a little behind, the big man's posture easy, almost bored, like he couldn't imagine anyone being foolish enough to follow him. Crawford, though. Crawford never looked back, but Thomas noticed the way his head would tilt slightly, listening. Crawford was the dangerous one, the kind who would catch you not because he saw you, but because he felt you. The men stopped once, at a bend in the creek where the water pooled dark and slow. Finch dismounted, took a tin cup from his saddlebag, and knelt to fill it. Hutchinson lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up into the cold air. Crawford stood still, eyes drifting over the tree line like he could read it. Thomas didn't breathe. He crouched low, still as stone, every muscle coiled in silence. He watched the way Finch cupped the water, the way Hutchinson smoked with his left hand, the way Crawford's gaze lingered just a beat too long on a stand of spruce 20 yards away from where Thomas hid. Then, as quick as they'd stopped, they mounted again. Finch took the lead, and they hurned. 3 of them disappeared into the narrowing road that cut deeper into the mountains. Thomas stayed put until their hoofbeats faded completely. Then he moved down to the creek. He stepped where Finch had knelt, pressed his fingers into the wet mud, feeling the impression left by the man's boots. He could tell from the wear pattern that Finch favored his right leg slightly. A weakness. Not much, but maybe enough. He found the still smoldering end of Hutchinson's cigarette in the dirt, took it, rolled it between his fingers, smelled the tobacco. Everything a man touched left a story, and Thomas was learning to read them. The sun was rising now, sending pale gold through the pines. Finch's men were long gone, but Thomas wasn't disappointed. He hadn't followed them to act, not yet. Today had been a test. Could he keep pace without being seen? Could he memorize the details without missing a step? The answer was yes, and tomorrow he would get closer. Much closer. 2 days later, the mountains were breathing fog. It rolled low between the ridges, thick enough to swallow the trail 10 steps ahead. Thomas used it as cover, moving through the wet silence until he found the same road where Finch's men had ridden before. He didn't have to wait long. Hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, approached from the west. This time there were 4 riders, not 3, Finch, Hutchinson, and Crawford, plus a man Thomas had never seen. Thin, sharp-faced, dressed in a black coat that looked out of place in the wilderness. He didn't ride like a mountain man, he sat his horse too straight, like a soldier. The four of them turned off the road, heading up a narrow path that climbed toward old mining country, places most folks avoided because of cave-ins and bad air. Thomas followed at a crawl, keeping the fog between them. After half an hour, the riders dismounted near a collapsed mine entrance. The air smelled of rust and damp stone. Finch spoke first, his voice low but clear in the stillness. "This is it. We'll get what we came for and be gone before noon." The man in the black coat knelt by the entrance, brushing away loose rock. "It's here. Same as the map said. You'll get your pay when the wagons are loaded." Wagons, plural. Whatever they were after, it was more than a few sacks of ore. Hutchinson and Crawford began clearing the entrance with heavy picks, the clang of metal echoing off the stone. Thomas stayed low behind a cluster of boulders, listening. Then Finch's voice again, quieter this time, almost cautious. "And you're sure it's safe?" The stranger didn't look up from his work. "Safe enough if you don't linger. The last crew stayed too long and never came out. You've read the reports." Finch's jaw tightened. "I've read the reports." Thomas's gut turned cold. He didn't know what they were digging for, but it wasn't gold. No one talks out gold like that. When the hole was clear enough for a man to crawl through, Crawford lit a lantern. The light caught his face, and for a moment Thomas saw something there. Hesitation. Crawford wasn't afraid of much, but whatever was inside that mine had its own weight. The stranger went in first, lantern in hand. Finch followed, then Hutchinson. Crawford stayed outside, keeping watch. He leaned against a rock, chewing on a piece of grass, his eyes scanning the fog. Thomas waited, counting every minute. After what felt like an hour, they emerged. The stranger's lantern was dimmer now, but Thomas could see the sacks slung over Hutchinson's shoulders. They weren't heavy enough to be ore, and when Hutchinson set them down, the sound they made wasn't stone. It was dull, muffled, almost like the shifting of bones. Finch tied the sacks to the back of his horse. "No one sees this. No one talks about this. We ride straight through." The stranger just nodded. "And remember, if anyone asks, this never happened." They mounted and rode off into the fog, leaving the mine mouth gaping like an open wound in the mountain. Thomas stayed frozen for a long time, staring at that black hole. He didn't know exactly what they'd found, but he knew it wasn't meant for daylight. By the time Thomas reached the cabin, the fog had followed him down from the ridges. It clung to the valley, softening the shapes of the trees and muting the sound of his boots on the dirt path. From a distance, the place looked the same, smoke from the chimney, the old apple tree swaying in the breeze. But the closer he got, the more wrong it felt. The door was shut, but not latched. One of the shutters banged loosely against the siding. He stepped inside. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. Sarah's knitting lay half-finished on the table, the needles crossed like she'd just set them down. But there was no sign of Sarah, no sign of Ruth. The silence was heavier than the fog outside. He moved to the back room. Ruth's blanket was on the floor, trampled. The wooden toy horse he'd carved her was tipped over on its side, one leg snapped clean off. Thomas's breath quickened. He scanned the room, his eyes catching on something that didn't belong, a wet boot print near the doorway. Not his, too big for Sarah's. He knelt, pressing his fingers into the print. Fresh. Whoever it was hadn't been gone long. He went outside, scanning the ground. The fog made it harder, but the tracks were there, heading toward the tree line. 2 sets, adult-sized, both moving fast. Thomas followed them for 50 yards before stopping. From the edge of the woods, a scrap of fabric fluttered from a low branch. He pulled it free. Blue cotton, Sarah's dress, torn. Something rustled in the trees ahead. He froze, listening. Then, faint but clear, a voice, male, carried through the fog. "Keep moving. Finch wants them before sundown." The sound of it hit him like a hammer. Finch wasn't just after land or gold or whatever cursed thing he'd dug out of that mine. He was taking people. Thomas's grip tightened on the fabric. His chest felt hollow, but his mind was already moving, calculating. He couldn't charge in blind, not against Finch's men. They'd kill him before he got within 10 yards. He turned back toward the cabin. He needed his rifle, his pack, and every round of ammunition he had left. This wasn't about watching anymore. It wasn't about patience. They'd taken his family. Now it was war. The mountain trail curved like a spine, narrow and steep, with nothing but empty air on one side and a wall of jagged rock on the other. Thomas knew it well. Every turn, every loose stone, every choke point where a man could disappear without leaving a trace. By late afternoon, the fog had thinned enough for him to see the valley below. He crouched low in the scrub, working quickly. A length of rawhide cord stretched across the trail, anchored to a heavy rock he'd wedged into a crevice. Beneath it, hidden under dirt and pine needles, he set the trap. 2 sharpened stakes lashed together, angled toward where a horse's legs would land. It wasn't meant to kill, just to drop a rider hard and fast. His rifle lay across his lap, loaded and ready. The old Winchester was scarred from years of use, but it had never failed him. He checked the chamber again anyway. He didn't have to wait long. Hoofbeats carried up the trail, slow, deliberate, the sound of men riding with weight in their saddlebags. He could make out 3 riders now, their shapes stretching long in the fading light. Finch wasn't with them. Thomas guessed he'd stayed behind with the stranger in the black coat. That was fine. Finch's men would still know where Sarah and Ruth were. The lead rider reached the cord first. The rawhide snapped taut. The horse screamed, going down hard, throwing its rider into the dirt. The second man swerved, his boot catching the edge of the trail, nearly unseating him. The third yanked hard on the reins, cursing. Thomas stepped out from behind the rock, rifle to his shoulder. "Drop your guns." The man on the ground groaned, blood running from a cut on his forehead. The other 2 froze, hands hovering near their holsters. "I said drop them." His voice carried flat and cold. One gun hit the dirt, then the other. Thomas kept the rifle steady. "Where are they?" The second rider's jaw tightened. "Who?" He took one step closer, sight fixed on the man's chest. "My wife. My daughter. You've got 3 seconds to start talking." The injured man coughed. They're at the old way station, South Fork of the Ridge Road. Finch said to keep 'em there till..." "Till what?" Thomas cut in. The man hesitated, glancing at his partner. "Till they finish loading the wagons." Thomas's stomach turned. Whatever they'd pulled out of that mine, Sarah and Ruth were tied to it now. He backed up slowly, still covering them with the rifle. "Leave your horses. Start walking down the trail. Don't look back." The men obeyed, cursing under their breath as they disappeared into the trees. Thomas moved fast. He cut the rawhide cord, grabbed the nearest horse, and swung into the saddle. The way station wasn't far, but if Finch got there first, it would be over before nightfall. The way station sat in a hollow between 2 ridges, a squat, weathered building with a rusted tin roof. Once, it had been a stop for mail coaches. Now it looked abandoned, windows boarded, the sign over the door half rotted away. Thomas reined in at the edge of the clearing. The place was too quiet. No guards out front, no horses tied up, just the faint smell of smoke drifting from a chimney that shouldn't have been burning. He slid off the saddle, tied the horse to a low branch, and moved along the tree line, keeping low. A sliver of lamplight cut through a gap in the boards over one window. He pressed his ear to the wood. Inside, voices. "Finch says we load before the storm hits. Get those crates to the mine entrance." "Storm won't matter if he can't keep it contained. You saw what happened last time. That's why we keep the women separate, keeps them calm." Thomas's gut twisted. He shifted along the wall until he found a loose board. Peering through, he saw the room clearly. 3 men moving heavy wooden crates, each one stamped with the mark from Finch's claim papers. In the far corner, behind a locked gate, sat Sarah and Ruth. Sarah's hands were bound, her face pale but steady. Ruth was curled in her lap, half asleep, her small hands clutching the hem of her mother's dress. Thomas's chest tightened. Then his eyes caught on one of the crates as it tipped in a man's grip. The lid shifted, and something inside moved. Not the clink of ore or the dull weight of stone, something alive. It let out a sound, low, almost a growl, but muffled, like it came from deep inside. The man holding the crate swore under his breath. "Don't let it hear you," another warned. Thomas's skin prickled. He leaned closer. Inside, in the dim light, he thought he saw the briefest flash of movement, a pale, almost human hand pressing against the slats before slipping back into the dark. The men carried it toward the back room, where a heavy steel door stood ajar. Beyond it, the air shimmered faintly, like heat rising from the ground, even though the night was cold. He pulled away from the wall, his heart hammering. This wasn't just about gold or stolen land. Finch had found something in that mine, and whatever it was dangerous enough to keep in cages and guard with guns. Thomas gripped the rifle tight. He had one shot to get Sarah and Ruth out before those men came back. One shot to do it without drawing whatever was in that crate toward them. From the corner of the building, footsteps crunched in the dirt. Someone was coming around back. Thomas melted into the shadows, waiting. The footsteps grew louder, steady and unhurried, like the man had no reason to think anyone was near. Thomas stayed pressed to the wall, breathing through his nose, rifle braced but angled down so the barrel wouldn't catch the lamplight. The guard rounded the corner, a tall man with a battered hat pulled low, a shotgun resting over his shoulder. His mouth moved as he hummed something tuneless, probably just to break the silence. Thomas stepped forward fast, catching him by the collar with one hand and driving the rifle butt into the side of his head. The man went limp before he hit the dirt. Thomas dragged him into the shadow of the woodpile and stripped the shotgun from his grip. He paused, listening. No alarm. The men inside kept working, their voices carrying low through the boards. Moving quickly, he found the back door, unlocked but swollen from years of rain. It groaned when he pushed it open, and he froze, waiting to see if anyone reacted. No movement. Inside, the smell hit him first. Oil, sweat, and something sharper, metallic, like rust mixed with blood. The hallway was narrow, walls lined with empty hooks where mailbags used to hang. Now, ropes and chains dangled instead. He could hear Sarah's voice from the main room, soft, speaking to Ruth. "It's all right. Just keep your eyes on me, sweetheart." Thomas moved to the doorway and peered in. The three men were still near the steel door, arguing now. "Told you," Finch said. "Don't open it without him." "Yeah, well, you tell that to what's inside when it starts tearing the slats out." Thomas's focus shifted to the corner where Sarah and Ruth sat. The padlock on the gate was thick, but the hinge pins looked worn. If he could get to it without drawing fire. A floorboard creaked behind him. He spun, shotgun up. A fourth man stood in the shadows, eyes wide. He didn't have time to shout before Thomas lunged. D, jamming the barrel into his chest. The blast echoed like thunder in the cramped space, drowning out the shouts from the other room. The men inside dropped what they were doing. One went for his gun, the others charged toward the noise. Thomas ducked back into the hall, drawing them away from Sarah and Ruth. Bullets splintered the walls as he fired twice, dropping one man where he stood. The others fell back toward the steel door. That's when Thomas heard it. Deep from behind the door, a sound like nails scraping stone, followed by a low, guttural breath. The steel frame shivered as something pressed against it from the other side. The two men glanced at each other, pale now. One whispered, "It's awake." Thomas didn't wait to find out what that meant. He barreled into the main room, grabbed the nearest crate to use as cover, and made for the gate where Sarah and Ruth waited. The padlock was thick iron, but the hinges were the weak point. Thomas slammed the shotgun stock against them once, twice. The metal bent on the third blow. Sarah flinched at the sound, but kept her eyes on him, shielding Ruth behind her. "Get ready to run," he said. Behind him, one of the men shouted, "Forget him! Hold the door!" That was when the steel door groaned, not the kind of groan wood makes when it swells, but the deep, grinding cry of metal being pulled out of shape. A seam opened in the middle, no thicker than a coin at first, but wide enough for a pale, thin hand to push through, fingers like bone, skin stretched too tight, nails blackened. The men rushed to brace it, but the thing on the other side shoved again. The hinges shrieked. Thomas swung the shotgun one more time, and the gate burst inward. Sarah grabbed Ruth's hand and stumbled out, eyes darting to the steel door. "What is that?" she whispered. "Doesn't matter. Move." They ran for the back hallway. A loud snap rang out behind them. The steel door's lock had given way. The men screamed, not in fear of Thomas now, but of what had been held inside. Something stepped through. Thomas didn't dare look fully, just caught flashes in the lamplight, a face that looked almost human but wrong in ways he couldn't name, too long in the jaw, eyes reflecting light like an animal's. It moved without sound except for the scrape of claws across the floorboards. One man fired at it. The thing didn't slow. It was on him in an instant, the sound of tearing flesh sharp and wet. Thomas shoved Sarah and Ruth ahead of him, covering their backs. The hallway felt tighter now, the air thick with the metallic stink of blood. They burst out the back door into the cold night. His horse was still tied to the branch. He cut the rope with his knife, hoisted Ruth up, then Sarah. "Go, don't stop till you're past the river," he told her. She shook her head. "You're coming too." "I will," he lied. The noise inside grew louder. Splintering wood, something heavy crashing to the floor. Thomas slapped the horse's flank. It bolted into the trees with Sarah and Ruth clinging tight. He turned back toward the way station, shotgun ready, knowing he had to give them more time. The doorway glowed faintly now, like the thing inside brought its own light, and then it stepped into the clearing. It stopped just outside the doorway, its head tilting as if it was studying him. The faint light came from somewhere beneath its skin, a sickly yellow glow that pulsed with each slow breath. Thomas kept the shotgun steady, but his hands itched to reload. 2 shells left. He knew from experience that sometimes that wasn't enough. The creature stepped forward. Its movements were wrong, jerky, like it was trying to remember how walking worked. When it lifted its head fully, Thomas saw its mouth, too wide, lined with teeth that curved inward like a trap. "What are you?" he asked, though part of him didn't want the answer. Its voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried across the clearing like wind through a canyon. "Hungry." That was all the warning he got. It lunged, crossing the space between them faster than he thought possible. Thomas fired both barrels in its face. The blasts tore chunks from its head and chest, but instead of dropping, it staggered, head twitching violently. A sound rose from its throat, not pain, but something closer to a laugh. Thomas backed toward the woodpile, fumbling for more shells. The thing came on, slower now, but deliberate, claws dragging lines through the frozen dirt. Its eyes never left his. From somewhere deep inside the building came the sound of chains falling, as if more than one had been used. He realized with a cold twist in his gut that this might not be the only one. He reloaded and fired again, aiming for the legs. The blast tore one out from under it, sending it crashing to the ground. For a moment he thought it might be over. Then it began dragging itself forward with its arms, faster than before. Thomas grabbed the lantern hanging by the door and smashed it on the creature's back. The oil caught, flames racing up its body. It screamed this time, a high, shrill wail that made the hair on his neck stand up. It too crashed, rolling in the dirt, the fire eating through the strange, pale skin. The smell was worse than anything he'd ever known, a mix of burning meat and something chemical. He didn't wait to see if it would burn out. He turned and ran for the trees, hoping Sarah and Ruth had made it far enough ahead. Behind him, the screaming turned into a deep, guttural howl that seemed to follow him into the dark. The pines closed around him, branches clawing at his coat. Moonlight barely broke through, leaving the path ahead a blur of shifting shadows. Thomas's breath burned in his throat, but he didn't slow. Somewhere ahead, the horse's hooves drummed against the frozen earth. Then he heard it. Behind him, not the crashing of branches or the heavy rhythm of something running, but the soft scrape of claws on bark. The sound came from above. He looked up and caught a flicker of movement in the canopy. Whatever had been burning was gone now. The thing's skin looked blackened and cracked, but it was still moving, its body spidering between the treetops with impossible speed. He pumped the shotgun once more, even though he knew it wouldn't do much now. Every instinct told him to keep running, but another part, the part that had been hunting and killing dangerous things for years, wanted to face it, end it. The forest opened into a frozen creek bed. His boots slid on the ice and he nearly went down. The sound of claws grew louder. Something landed behind him with a thud. He spun, firing on reflex. The blast tore through the thing's shoulder, spraying black fluid across the snow. It didn't even flinch. It stepped closer, head cocked, its glowing eyes fixed on his face. "You leave me hungry," it rasped. Thomas dropped the shotgun. It was more dead weight now than weapon, and pulled the hunting knife from his belt. The blade was silvered, etched with markings most people didn't believe in. He'd seen it work on things no bullet could kill. The creature stopped. For the first time, it hesitated. "That's right," Thomas said, voice low. "You know what this is." It moved then, not with the clumsy lurch from before, but with sudden, perfect speed. The two collided in the middle of the creek, the impact knocking the breath from his chest. Claws tore at his coat, teeth snapping inches from his face. Thomas drove the knife upward, feeling it sink through hide and bone. The thing screamed again, louder than before, shaking so hard he thought it might rip the blade from his grip. They crashed to the ice, rolling, his hands locked on the hilt, pushing deeper until the knife's guard hit flesh. The glow in its eyes flared bright, then flickered. Somewhere in the distance, the horse screamed, and Thomas knew this wasn't over. Thomas wrenched the knife free, black blood steaming on the blade. The creature twitched once, twice, then went still. He didn't trust it to stay that way. Without looking back, he sprinted toward the distant sound of the horse. The forest thinned, the moonlight brightening enough to show the trail of hoofprints in the snow. He followed them, heart pounding, every muscle screaming for rest. Then he saw the sleigh. It was tipped sideways in the snow, one runner splintered, the horse gone. Sarah stood beside it, clutching Ruth against her chest, eyes wide and fixed on something behind him. "Thomas," she whispered, "there's another one." He spun. At the edge of the trees, half shrouded in shadow, stood a second creature. Taller than the first, its skin was a mottled grey, its jaw unhinged, wider than human bone should allow. It stepped forward, the snow hissing where its feet touched. Thomas raised the knife, though exhaustion made his grip weak. "Get behind me," he said. The thing didn't rush. It circled slowly, eyes flicking between Thomas and the women. The way it moved felt deliberate, almost curious. "Why aren't you attacking?" Thomas said, more to himself than it. The creature's head tilted. "Because you killed my brother." The voice was deeper than the first one's, and colder. Sarah gasped. Ruth buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Thomas kept his stance, his eyes locked on the thing. "Then you know I'll do the same to you." It smiled, a terrible, slow stretch of lips over too many teeth. "Not tonight." And then, with a single leap, it was gone into the trees, vanishing so fast the snow barely had time to fall from the branches it disturbed. Thomas waited, listening, but the forest had gone silent again. Only the wind moved. Sarah's voice trembled. "We need to leave, now." He nodded. "We will, but this isn't finished." By dawn, they had made it to the edge of the old logging road. The horse had returned, spooked and lathered in sweat, but alive. Thomas hitched it to what was left of the sleigh, and they rode in silence toward the nearest settlement. The cold air stung his face, but it was the weight in his chest that made breathing hard. Sarah kept Ruth wrapped in a blanket, rocking her gently, though the girl hadn't spoken since the night before. When they reached the first cabin, a man stepped out to greet them. He was older, his beard crusted with frost. His eyes flicked over the broken sleigh, the blood on Thomas's coat, and the burned marks on his hands. "You saw it, didn't you?" the man said quietly. Thomas didn't answer right away. "I killed one." The man's face darkened. "One is never alone." Thomas glanced at the tree line. For a moment he thought he saw movement far back in the shadows, a shape, tall and still, watching. Then it was gone. They went inside. the warmth of the fire doing little to chase the cold from his bones. He cleaned the knife and set it on the table. Its silver edge caught the light, the runes faint but unbroken. Sarah sat across from him, eyes searching his. "Will it come back?" "Yes," Thomas said. "It knows my face now." He didn't tell her the rest, that the second one hadn't been hunting him out of hunger, but out of something older, something that felt like vengeance. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that didn't belong to the forest. Low, almost human, almost a laugh. Thomas's hand rested on the knife. He wasn't running anymore.